guys, we're back with another video continuing the series as promised on rebel canning, or as one of the commenters said in the previous video that we should call it regular canning, because this is how it's been done for generations until relatively recently when pressure canning was introduced and invented. This is still how it's done by the Amish and many people throughout the nation, and this is how it is still done in most countries throughout the world to this day. It's a very simple method of food preservation, but we mentioned in that video that we did in how to save all of the meat in your freezer in case of an emergency grid down situation, where I gave tips for basically bulk canning if you absolutely had to do it this way and you had no other option. And we had a lot of interest. In fact, that video pretty much just, blew up like an unwatched pressure canner. You see what I did? I made a joke there. Anyway, I think I'm going to call this method heritage canning instead of rebel canning and regular canning, because rebel canning is meant to give a very negative connotation, and really it is the heritage canning. It is the way that it has been done. But in this video, I'm going to explain to you in detail the science behind and the difference between pressure canning and water bathing, also known as preferred canning or rebel canning. I will explain in depth to you botulism, how it works, how to neutralize it in detail so that you can understand whichever method you are using. And remember, this is important for us to explain this and really kind of research and delve into this, because for us to assume in America that everyone has access to a pressure canner is kind of very arrogant. Through the comments and the things that I have learned, even from posting the last video, I'm finding out that most people all over the world do not have access to pressure canners and didn't even know they existed until they started watching American homestead videos on YouTube and looking to buy them. They were way, way, way beyond their budget. In fact, in some countries, in most countries, even just the mason jars were too expensive for them. So we're going to talk about solutions to all of this, and we're going to give good information for all of my viewers that are from other nations on how to make your preservation very, very safe and effective. So we're going to go through the science. Stick with me. This may be a little chatty because it's a a question and answer session, but you're going to get a lot of knowledge and information and confidence from it. And for the history buffs out there, you're going to learn a lot too. And that's why I love to research heritage methods. And I will also answer all of your questions about rebel canning from the comments that were made in the other video on bulk canning and meat preservation, on how to save everything in your freezer in an emergency grid down situation. We had a lot of great questions and comments, and we're going to address that in this video. So stay tuned. Okay, so if this is the first video that you're seeing and you have no idea what we're talking about, the first question we're going to have to answer is, what is rebel canning, or what I'm going to call heritage canning? In essence, it is basically the method of water bathing everything, not using a pressure canner for anything. Now, again, I'll put up the disclaimer. I'm not telling anyone to do this. I'm just giving information because I love history. I love seeing simple, practical ways to do things. I love finding out how the people in past generations did things when they had less resources than we have now. I like having options in an emergency situation. If you have a better option, then use it. But again, I have a lot of viewers in other nations, like I said, and they don't have a better option. So I would rather give them the information that they need to make the method that they're using as safe and effective as possible. And also for us to learn from them in case we find ourselves in a very difficult situation. We are not guaranteed to always have a prosperous and abundant nation. So these things in our knowledge bank are very, very important. And I'm going to start this by saying that I have really, really enjoyed the comments that you have been sharing with us in the meat preservation video that I just recently posted. where we talked about how to bulk can water bath meat for an emergency, saving your meat in an emergency situation. I honestly, when I posted the video, I really expected a lot more hostility and blowback than what I got. What we really have is a wealth of information in that comment section. So many comments from people that are like, I'm 70 years old. This is how I've done it my whole life. This is how my mom did it. This is how my grandma did it. Or I'm 96 years old and I've never done it any other way and we've never had any problems. So many people just sharing their experiences, or people in other countries where they said, I'm from such and such country. This is the only way that we do it. This is the way we've always done it. Sharing your experience in the comment sections really helps others who have no experience with this method or this process, or those who really want to learn the heritage or the cultural applications of water bathing everything. So I encourage you again in this one to share your experiences. If you are someone who has been doing this for your whole life or for generations, or if you're from a country or a nation, list where you're from and tell us what is the common method where you are. So put that in the comments. That is really helpful. I actually learned a lot just from reading the comments in the other videos. In fact, one comment that really stood out to me in particular that I found very interesting was from Sue, who said that she actually has a ball canning cookbook from the 1940s that gives you the recommended cook times for water bathing meat and veggies, and how long you should water bath to store meat and veggies, and all of these things that now they tell us that we cannot do. So those comments are very interesting to me from a historical standpoint, and I think that they're very valuable to others who are researching this kind of preservation. So having said all of that, let's get right into the teaching, the information, the presentation, and ask the question for those who are learning, what is botulism? Because the biggest fear in home canning is botulism, and that's what people have been hammered with. Don't can your own food at home. You're going to kill your whole family. And we touched on this a little bit in the last video, and I told you I would come back and make this video and we would go into it in depth. So what is botulism and why is it dangerous? Botulism is a bacteria that can grow in a negative oxygen environment, which when you're canning, you're removing the oxygen from the jar. So you're creating a prime environment for this bacteria to grow. The bacteria in and of itself is actually not dangerous at all, and I will explain to you why in a few minutes. And it is killed very easily by boiling water or reaching temperatures of 212 degrees, which you can reach by water bathing. The botulism bacteria produces a spore, or you can think of it as like an egg or a seed, that, or in and of themselves, not dangerous, but that the FDA tells us cannot be killed until it reaches temperatures of 240 degrees, which a pressure canner can reach, but boiling water does typically not reach those high temperatures. So the bacteria is not dangerous, the spore is not dangerous. However, within the life cycle of the bacteria produces a toxin that is dangerous, but can very easily be neutralized. So again, we'll get into all of that in a minute. I'm just trying to laying the foundation so we can understand what we are dealing with. So what kills botulism? Two things kill botulism: heat and acid. So the first thing we're going to look at is acid. If botulism is killed by acid, and the spores are too, actually, this is one of the reasons that they tell us that high acid foods are okay to water bath. So it's okay to water bath jams and high acid fruits, and you pack them in a sugar syrup and it's okay, but no low acid foods. Those have to be pressure canned because high acid levels will kill botulism. Well, this is why the bacteria and the spores are not dangerous to a healthy human adult, because the level of acidity in your stomach is far, far, far greater than the level of acidity in a jar of pears with sugar water in it. The pears with the sugar water in it are considered safe because they're a higher acid food. The acid level is high enough to kill off botulism bacteria. Again, your stomach acid is so much more acidic than those canned goods. So if you ingest botulism, it will die as soon as it hits your stomach. This is why babies get botulism from eating things like honey, because their stomachs are not producing the acid that is necessary to kill it off. And so the bacteria can make it through their stomach into their intestines, where it can then begin to live out its life cycle and produce the toxins. So a baby is not supposed to have honey, for example, until it's a year old, because its stomach is not producing enough acid to kill off the botulism bacteria. So this tells us that after a year old, your body can kill botulism very easily. And it also tells us that we're all eating botulism all the time. And you know, if you eat things like honey, it lives in the dirt. So root plants like potatoes and carrots and things like that will carry botulism. But again, I just want you to understand and have this understanding of what you're dealing with. This has been kind of promoted as something that is unique to home canned foods, and it's so dangerous you should never do it, but it's not. This is something that is in our environment that we all encounter all the time and just don't realize it. This is why also a lot of times when people water bath, they will add a little bit of vinegar to each jar. This is to raise the acidity level to make sure that it's killing off any botulism spores or bacteria that might be in the jar. The next thing that kills off botulism, both the bacteria and the spores, is heat. Now, the bacteria itself is killed within 10 minutes of boiling. Now, the reason that you boil for such a long length of time is to make sure that the temperature inside the contents of your jar makes it all the way to the middle of the jar. So as long as you can get all of the contents of the jar up to a boil for a length of 10 minutes, then you're going to kill off any botulism bacteria that is in the jar. Now, we understand that it's not actually the bacteria or the spores that makes you sick, but it's actually the toxin that they produce. So can the toxin be neutralized by heat? Yes. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from a paper posted on the website of the USDA themselves that will tell you that even the toxin is absolutely neutralized within 10 minutes of boiling. And so we're going to pull this up, and I'm not going to read the whole report, but I'm going to read you just this part because this is what we're going to look at. The canning process will remove the oxygen from the jar, creating a low oxygen environment okay, there's a typo in the USDA's website. It says will allow. I think they meant that will allow the spores to grow into active bacteria. When the jars are stored at room temperature, the spores can germinate and produce the toxin. However, the toxin is sensitive to heat and can be destroyed if the food in question is boiled for 10 minutes or a little longer at higher altitudes. So, this is what I would say. For those who have to use this method, if you want to be absolutely 100% sure that you do not have any bacteria or any toxin, then all you have to do is when you open the jar before you eat the food, put it in a pot, bring it up to a boil, and heat it for at least 10 minutes. I'm going to be honest, I do this with everything that comes out of a can or out of a jar. I don't care if it was processed in a factory, if it was processed in a pressure canner, if it was processed in a water bath. If it's old food that's been processed and canned or jarred, I'm going to make sure that it's heated up into a boil, because you are not guaranteed that there is no botulism just because you used a pressure canner, okay? Now, understand that botulism is very rare. So even not following these procedures, the chances of you getting it, especially if you're clean and sanitary when you're canning, are extremely low to begin with. But if you boil your food, if you heat it up properly before you eat it, then you absolutely completely nullify any chance at all of making anyone sick. And it's that simple. If you have a pressure canner and you want a pressure can, then that is great, do it. But I still recommend that you heat your food thoroughly before you eat it. If you don't have a pressure canner, if you're from a country where you can't get a pressure canner, if you're in an emergency situation where you can't use a pressure canner and you have to do water bath, you can. And you can make it very, very safe and effective if you boil the food, bring it up to temperature for at least 10 minutes before you eat it. I would always do this, and I recommend that you do as well. Again, this is why we're sharing this information, because again, not everyone has the option to use pressure canners or expensive equipment. So how can we make this more safe and effective for those who are already doing this? Let's give them the information. Let's look into what is really taking place. So having said all of that, let's talk a little bit about how rare botulism really is, because it is extremely rare. Now, it does exist, and we need to take it serious. That's why we just went through the science, the facts, and understanding how to completely neutralize it. But let's look at the truth. Let's look at the statistics here. In general, most reported botulism cases in America, in general, actually come from Botox and not from anything that anybody is eating. In case you didn't know, the Botox injections that people get to kind of paralyze their face so they don't have any wrinkles is actually botulism that they're injecting into their face, and it's causing a paralysis so they smooth out their wrinkles. And they, do it wrong. They get too much. It gets in their blood system. They get botulism poisoning. That accounts for most of the cases of botulism in the United States. Now, of food-borne botulism cases, the majority of those in the United States are either from, as we mentioned earlier, babies eating things that they're not supposed to before their stomach and digestive tract is developed enough to handle it, or it is from, and here's a kicker, commercially processed foods. Statistically speaking, even though it is promoted that botulism is primarily this home canning sickness, statistically speaking, the vast majority of the cases, and they're still rare, there's not many. I think we had 1 year, there was 26 cases, and of the 26 cases, 5 of them were attributed to home processing. The rest were commercially processed foods. So again, you cannot avoid the threat of botulism by avoiding home processed foods. In fact, you're actually more susceptible in commercially processed foods because you have the same problems, but you don't have the same care or detail to attention that you have in your own kitchen. So I hope that this kind of helped a little bit in understanding what botulism is, how it works, how to mitigate the threat of it, and that you really don't have to be all that scared of it. Now, I'm not making light of botulism. If a person really gets sick with the botulism toxin, as we stand right now in our current healthcare system, they actually do have very effective treatments for it, and it's usually cured pretty quickly and pretty easily. But without those treatments, it can cause paralysis, and it can even cause respiratory paralysis that would cause you to not be able to breathe. So there is a threat. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist and that it's not serious, but I'm saying that you face that threat every time you eat something from the store or anywhere. So take care in your own cooking, in your own kitchen, and take these precautions, and you'll be fine. Get a healthy immune system, build up your stomach acid, which is good for you, and make sure you heat your food. So now we're going to answer the questions that were asked in the previous video, because I've spent days answering the same questions over and over, and they're great questions that will help you to really understand Rebel canning. So for everyone who watched the previous message about how to preserve the meat in your freezer in an emergency situation, and then I showed you how you can bulk water bath can using this big crawfish boiling pot that I have and a propane burner. One of the big questions that I had a lot in the comments was, what size is your pot and where can I get it? The pot that I have, I was a little unsure if I had a 64 quart or an 80 quart, but I checked and it's an 80 quart. And you can get them in like a 60 quart up to like 100 quart, and any of those would work fine. The pot that I have in that video, and I'll link the video up for those who haven't seen it, is an 80 quart pot. Now, technically, I could fit 3 cases of jars in that pot at a time, like 70 jars. I probably would not use more than 2 cases because that would give me enough space above the jars to add a lot of water so that I wouldn't have to be adding water because of evaporation. Because when you're doing a 3-hour water bath, you will get evaporation. So that is another very important point, that if you get evaporation to the point where your jars are getting exposed and you need to add more water, you need to heat that water up. Have a kettle on the side with some boiling water or whatever. You need to heat that water up. You do not want to add cold water to your boiling water, because if you reduce the boil, then you have to start the timer over, which is another question that we had. Do you start timing from when you put the jars in or from when it starts boiling? You start timing from when it starts boiling. Once you get a hard boil, you start your timer for 3 hours. If it stops boiling at any point, you have to stop the timer over. That's why if you need to add water, you need to add hot water so you don't interrupt the boil. So the pot that I had was 80 quarts, and if you want to find one like that, all you have to do is go online and search for crawfish boiling pot. Some places they might call it a seafood boiler. If they don't, we have crawfish in Louisiana, so we call it a crawfish boiling pot. I know that most of your big box stores and hardware stores and online places that you buy things will have it. Just search for crawfish boiling pot and get whatever size is convenient for you. Again, the one in the video that I have was a 80 quart pot, which if you're canning quart jars, that kind of gives you an idea of how many you can can. Obviously not a full 80 because there's going to be spacing issues, but like I said, you can put 70 in there if you're willing to add water, or you can just put 2 cases, which is 24, which is what I did, and that'll give you plenty space above to add enough water to not have to add water later because of evaporation. Okay, another important thing to know is that if you are water bathing in a pot or a canner that has a rack at the bottom, you're good. But if you don't have the little rack, or if you're using the big crawfish boiling pot like I had out there, you need to put a towel or something at the bottom before you put your jars in, something that will kind of buffer the heat from directly interacting with your jars, because they can crack your jars, plus the hard boil can get them clanking together. So line the bottom with a towel, put your jars, add the water, and then go from there. I'll do a video, probably today I'll film it, and I'll show you the whole process of water bathing meat, because we're all interested in learning these heritage methods and seeing how they work. Again, I am not telling you to do them, but I had so many requests that they wanted to see the process. I will very gladly show you the process, if nothing else than for educational purposes, so that we can learn how they do it in other cultures and how they do it and how our parents and grandparents have done it for years. So I'll do another video and I'll show you how to do that step by step by step. I will put up a video first though of how to pressure can it, so you can make an informed decision, because it's really not difficult. And if you have time to pressure can, then just do that. But if you're in a pinch and you have to do this, it is good to know how to do it and to understand the differences so that you can convert any pressure canning recipe into a water bath recipe. But until I get that done, edited and posted, I'll just kind of explain it to you right now in order to answer all of those questions. Some people asked if they needed to thaw the meat. Yes, you definitely want the meat to be thawed before you pack it into the jars. You do not want to put something frozen into a glass jar and put it in water and start boiling it, because you run risk anytime you're shifting temperatures too quickly with glass, you run risk of cracking it. So thaw the meat, plus you'll be able to pack a whole lot more in there. Pack it full, put it up to 1-inch headspace, put the lid on loosely, as with all canning, finger tight. Don't crank it on so tight, because when you boil, the contents are going to expand. And that's going to push the air out of the jar. You don't want it so tight that it can't push the air out of the jar, or it might explode the jar. So you want to just loosely put the lid on it. Put it in the pot, fill it up with water to over the top of the lids, get it to a hard rolling boil, start the timer, do 3 hours. We had questions about, do you add liquid, do you add salt, do you add vinegar? The rule of thumb with all canning applies here is that if you are raw packing, if you are putting just meat in the jar that is raw, you don't have to put anything, you don't have to put any liquids. There's enough liquid in the meat that will come out and make its own broth and juice in the jar. Me personally, when I raw pack, I always add about 1 inch of water, because I find that sometimes the meat doesn't have quite enough, which it will still be fine, it will still be preserved, but sometimes the meat at the top might be a little chewy because it's not in the juices. So for me, I usually put 1 inch of water when I'm raw packing, but you don't have to. Technically, you can just put the meat, put the lid, and go. You can put salt. It will help preservation a little. It's not technically necessary, but mostly it's just for taste. You can put any seasonings that you want, actually. But if you do put salt, most people will typically put about 1/2 tablespoon of salt per quart jar for flavor, for taste. And I think it will, in the long run, help with preservation, and bacteria doesn't like salt, so it doesn't hurt to do it. I do typically put salt in my meats and my vegetables. People asked, should you put vinegar? You don't have to put vinegar either. Vinegar will raise the acidity level a little, and it will help with preservation. It may help to prolong it a little longer than it otherwise would last. Most people that add vinegar, though, they only add it to vegetables and not to meat. Because again, remember that botulism comes from the dirt, so the chances of it being in meat are already almost nothing. But it's a little bit higher chance that it might be in vegetables. So a lot of times when people water bath vegetables, they do add 1/2 tablespoon of vinegar per jar of vegetables. Again, you don't have to, as long as you are heating. If you're in a situation where you do not have access to vinegar, you can do it without the vinegar. Just make sure that you heat that food up thoroughly before you eat it once you open the jars, just to make sure. And make sure everything is clean. And if you're dealing with root vegetables like potatoes and carrots, make sure you peel them first. Just make sure all the dirt is off and that they're really, really clean before you can that. And that's going to help go a long way towards making sure that your food is safe. Some people asked if you had to cook the meat first. You don't have to cook the meat first. You can raw pack water bath meat, and that's the method I'm going to show you in the video that I'm going to do, because again, we're talking about a last ditch effort emergency situation. When you have the least resources available, what do you do to save the meat that you have? So I'm going to show you that method. But if you stay tuned to the channel, I will be posting other recipes coming up of things that are cooked, meals in a jar, things that are saved on the shelf that all you have to do is heat up and eat and it'll be ready. So basically anything that you pressure can be water bathed, and you're going to follow all of the same procedures. You're just going to water bath it instead of pressure can it. So you can hot pack, which is cooking the meat some first. For example, I make jars of like meat and gravy, like for example, beef and gravy that I want to serve later, like maybe over mashed potatoes or something. Well, because I'm making the gravy and everything with it, I'm going to hot pack that. So yes, you can water bath those kinds of things. For example, if somebody's making chicken soup and they want the little chunks of meat, because when you raw pack meat, it tends to kind of clump together like a meatloaf, and when you pull it out, it just shreds apart like taco meat. But if you cook the meat a little bit first, like cut it into little chunks and cook it first, then it's going to hold that shape and texture better. So it just depends on what you're using it for or what you're cooking, whether you would want to do it cooked or raw. But you can do it both ways. But going back to the very reason that we would be doing this in the first place, for us at least, would be an emergency situation. Chances are it's going to be raw packed. But I have to give you all of this information because, again, like I said, we have people watching from nations all over the world where this is their only method and only option. So let's try to figure out how to do this the best that we can for all of us to be able to benefit from it. So here is a question for those who are viewing from other nations. For those in America, you may not realize this, but not only are pressure canners either too expensive or not available at all, but as we see in the comments from some of our viewers from overseas and other countries, the canning jars also are too expensive. We had one guy who mentioned, I think he was from Australia, that for him to get a case of mason jars would be the equivalent of about $60 US. And in other countries, it's even more or just impossible to find. So this question arose, can you reuse jars that you bought at the store that had other things in it? For example, you bought a jar of olives or a jar of pickles or a jar of spaghetti sauce or something like this. Can you in a jar that you got from the store, used up the contents and saved your jar and lid? Can you reuse it? And you would be surprised, but the answer is yes. And this is actually done a lot in other countries. And this used to be done a lot like during the Depression and times like that. So what you would be doing is you would be taking your jar, use your contents, save the jar, clean the jar really good, hot water. If you have the option to run it through your dishwasher, that would be great. Clean the lid. And then you would just pack into this, put the lid back on it, put it in the water bath, bring it up to a boil, do all of the same procedure. Then when it was cooled down, you would check it really good to make sure that it's sealed. And then that would be fine. You could definitely reuse jars. Most times they will reseal. And if you want to check, you can use these over and over and over and over. But what you're going to want to do before you use them, you're going to want to open it up. You're going to want to look at the bottom of your lid. You're going to want to kind of feel in there to make sure that the little kind of rubber gasket sealing area is still kind of moist and pliable, that it's not gashed or cut, that it's not rusted, that it's not dried up or cracked or anything like that. Because if that's the case, it probably won't seal. You won't waste the food that's in it. You'll just have to eat it because you probably won't get a seal on it. But for most cases, for most uses, you're going to get a lot of uses out of a jar. And yes, you can reuse them. And yes, this is done a lot in other countries. So I hope that answered some of your questions. I hope this helps you to understand how rebel canning works and doesn't just cause a whole bunch more questions. Stay tuned and have patience. I will do a video that takes you step by step through the process and shows you how it's done, so that you can kind of just understand that it really is the same as pressure canning. The only difference is that at the end, you're not putting it in the pressure canner. You're just putting it in a pot of boiling water and leaving it for a while. But we will look through the process and I'll show you how to do it. And again, fill those comments up with your experiences. If you have done this, if your grandma or grandpa or great granny used to do this, if you live in a country where they still do this, because that is a wealth of information and it is very important for those who have never experienced it to hear your experiences that will give them a greater understanding and wisdom and confidence if they need to do this in an emergency situation. It baffles me that people kind of think that just because they grew up in a nation or a place that was prosperous and had a lot of options, that they're always going to have those options. We're not guaranteed to always have those options. So though we may never have to use something like this, I would rather know that I can and how to do it if I have to. And if I don't have to, and I can find ways to help those who do have to use it to do it more safely, then I would rather do that. So that's why we're doing these videos. Again, I will give my disclaimer. This is for educational purposes. I'm not telling you that you have to do this. I'm not even telling you to do this. But for those who are interested in learning these heritage methods, I hope that this was helpful for you today. God bless.